Tonight, a former pastor of a Texas megachurch has surrendered to authorities in Oklahoma after being charged with 5 counts of lewd or indecent acts.
For more than 40 years, she stood quietly beside him while the rumors grew louder. The woman the whole congregation called the Blessed Woman. The wife who knew Robert Morris better than any elder or board member ever could. The world begged her to speak, to explain, to defend him or condemn him. And when she finally opened her mouth about her husband, what came out left everyone colder than the silence ever did. The day the empire fell. On the second day of October in the year 2025, inside a small courtroom in Pawhuska, Oklahoma, Robert Morris stood before a judge and pleaded guilty to 5 felony counts of lewd and indecent acts with a child. This was no longer a rumor whispered in church hallways. This was no longer an accusation his lawyers could spin into something softer. This was the founder of Gateway Church, a man who once advised a sitting president, admitting under oath that he had committed crimes against a little girl. The judge handed down a sentence of 10 years, with all but 6 months suspended, lifetime registration as a sex offender, and a restitution payment of $270,000. Before the hearing began, witnesses inside that room described something that still makes people uncomfortable to talk about. Robert Morris hugged each member of his family one by one, and then he turned and kissed his wife, Debbie. Throughout the entire proceeding, as the survivor read her statement aloud, he kept his eyes fixed downward toward the floor. He did not look up. He did not look at her. And Debbie, the woman the entire congregation had once called the Blessed Woman, sat beside him in total silence. For those who had followed Gateway Church for years, this moment felt impossible to believe. This was a church with more than 100,000 active members spread across multiple states. On any given weekend, close to 25,000 people would walk through the doors of its campuses to hear Robert Morris preach. He had written best-selling books that sat on the shelves of millions of Christian homes. He had served on the Evangelical Advisory Board of Donald Trump in the year 2016, and he had welcomed the president himself onto his stage. He was, by every measure the world uses, a giant. And now he was a convicted felon, walking out of a courtroom in handcuffs. When he was released from the Osage County Jail just after midnight on the 31st of March in the year 2026, his attorney finally delivered the first real apology the public had ever heard from him. In that statement, Robert Morris thanked his wife directly. He spoke of having a spouse like Debbie, who had, in his words, walked beside him faithfully through all of it. The survivor, a woman named Cindy Clemishire, responded almost immediately, and her words cut through everything. She made it clear that an apology offered the moment a man walks free means far less than one offered when he is being held accountable. But here is the question that nobody in the press conferences seemed willing to ask out loud. If Debbie Morris had truly walked beside her husband faithfully through all of it, then how much of it did she actually see? And to understand that question, we have to go back to the very beginning, to a Christmas night 4 decades before any of us knew his name. Pink pajamas and a promise to stay quiet. In the year 1981, a charming young traveling evangelist arrived in Tulsa, Oklahoma, to speak at a youth revival. He was in his early 20s, married to Debbie, and already the father of a baby boy. He had a gift for making people feel seen, a warmth that drew families toward him like moths toward a porch light. One of those families had a daughter named Cindy, who was just 11 years old at the time. Her parents adored this young preacher. They opened their home to him. They trusted him completely, the way good people trust a man of God who carries a Bible and speaks of heaven. That trust is exactly what made what happened next so devastating. On Christmas night in the year 1982, when Cindy was 12 years old and wearing pink pajamas with little bloomer pants, Robert Morris began to molest her. She has described that night so many times now that the details have become seared into the memory of anyone who has heard her speak. And when it was over, he gave her an instruction that would chain her in silence for years. He told her to never tell anyone about this because it would ruin everything. Think about the weight of those words placed on the shoulders of a 12-year-old child. She believed that if she opened her mouth, she would be the one who destroyed her family, her church, and the reputation of a man everyone loved. So she stayed quiet. And the abuse continued for roughly 4.5 years, across state lines from Oklahoma into Texas, more than 100 separate times by her own painful count. And during all of those years, where was Debbie? She was there. She was the wife in the next room, the woman raising a family alongside the man who was slipping away to harm a child. There is no evidence in any record that Debbie knew what was happening during those years, but the proximity is what haunts people. The same house, the same trips, the same dinners around the same table. A child is being destroyed in the shadows of a marriage that the world would later hold up as a model of Christian devotion. The secret stayed buried until the spring of 1987, when Cindy could no longer carry it alone. What happened when that secret finally came out would reveal something about Debbie that nobody saw coming. The phone call that changed everything. When Cindy finally told her parents the truth in the year 1987, the secret that had been buried for 4.5 years exploded into the open. Robert Morris was not a man who walked forward and confessed of his own free will. He was turned in, he was caught, and what followed was the kind of quiet, internal handling that has protected powerful men inside religious institutions for generations. He stepped away from ministry for what was supposed to be a season of restoration, and yet by his own written account in his own books, he was back in the pulpit in barely more than a month. But it is here, in the aftermath of 1987, that Debbie steps into this story for the very first time. And the way she steps in is something I want you to really sit with for a moment. According to Cindy Clemishire, when she was still a teenager, still a child trying to process what a grown man had done to her body and her mind, she received a phone call from Debbie Morris. And on that call, Debbie told her that she forgave her. Read that again slowly. The wife of the abuser called the child victim to offer forgiveness, as if the little girl in the pink pajamas had been the one who did something wrong, as if a 12-year-old had seduced a 21-year-old evangelist. Cindy has spoken about how that phone call made her feel, and her words are unforgettable. She said they wanted her to believe that she, the child, was somehow responsible for what happened to her. That phone call tells us something crucial. It tells us that as early as the 1980s, the woman who would later sit silently in a courtroom had already chosen which version of the truth she was going to live inside. She had already chosen her husband. I want to pause here and ask you something directly, because I think it matters. Have you ever watched someone you love do something so wrong that admitting it would shatter your entire life? And instead of facing it, you found a way to bend reality so you could keep loving them? That is the trap so many people fall into. It is human. It is heartbreaking. But when the person being protected is a predator and the person being blamed is a child, that bending of reality becomes something far darker than loyalty. And the next time Debbie's voice would appear in this story, it would come attached to a number with a lot of zeros. Put a price on it. By the time the year 2005 arrived, Cindy Clemishire was a grown woman. She had spent years in therapy, slowly untangling what had been done to her, and she had arrived at a truth that the 12-year-old version of herself could never have understood. What happened to her was not a sin she shared in. It was a crime committed against her. With that understanding came a need to confront the man who had stolen so much of her life. She sent an email demanding restitution. In that message, she wrote words that capture the depth of her wound. She told him that 23 years after he began destroying her life, she was still dealing with the pain and the damage he had caused. 2 days later, her phone rang. On the other end of that line were 2 voices, Robert Morris and his wife, Debbie. The transcript of that call would later be discovered on Morris's own church laptop by a former information technology employee. And the call itself began with Morris making sure Cindy knew that his wife was also listening. During that conversation, Robert Morris said something that reveals exactly how he viewed the suffering of the child he had abused. He told her to put a price on it. Put a price on it. As though decades of trauma were a transaction to be settled and closed. Cindy, pushed to name a number, eventually answered $2 million, and Morris ended the call. She has since explained that the call was never truly about money. Now, what did Debbie say during that phone call? This is one of the most important and most honest things I can tell you. We do not know. The records confirm only that she was on the line. She was present. She listened to her husband ask a survivor to put a price on her own abuse. And as far as any record shows, she did not stop it. 2 years later, in the year 2007, a lawyer hired by Morris would send a letter that blamed Cindy, claiming that a 12-year-old child had been the one who initiated the inappropriate behavior by climbing into a grown man's bed. They offered her $25,000 on the condition that she sign away her right to ever speak about it. She refused. That single act of defiance, that refusal to be silenced for the price of a used car, is the only reason you are hearing this story today. Because 17 years after she said no, everything that had been buried was about to be ripped into the light. The blog post that broke the empire. In the middle of June in the year 2024, a watchdog blogger named Dee Parsons published Cindy Clemeshire's account on her website, The Wartburg Watch. It became the most read post in the history of that blog. Within days, the story leapt from a small Christian watchdog site into the pages of major national news outlets. The empire that Robert Morris had spent his entire life building began to crack right down the middle. What happened next is a masterclass in how powerful men try to control a narrative. Robert Morris released a statement, and the language he chose was carefully crafted to deceive. He admitted that in his early 20s, he had been involved in what he called inappropriate sexual behavior with a young lady in a home where he was staying. He described it as kissing and petting. The leadership of Gateway Church echoed this framing, calling it a moral failure he had committed more than 35 years earlier. A young lady, a moral failure. Cindy Clemeshire shattered those words with a single sentence. She reminded the world that she was 12 years old. She was a little girl, a respected attorney, and former child abuse prosecutor named Boz Chivigian, who happens to be a grandson of the legendary Billy Graham, said plainly that words like young lady and moral failure were chosen to sanitize something that was, in fact, criminal. And then something else surfaced that made the carefully built confession collapse entirely. An old sermon from the year 2014 reappeared, and in it Robert Morris described his younger self with chilling honesty. He admitted that he had learned to lie and to manipulate, and he said that he had looked for the girls who would be the most susceptible. Those are his words, spoken from his own pulpit, to his own congregation. The man who told the public that his sin was a youthful moral failure had once bragged from a stage about hunting for the most vulnerable girls he could find. On the 18th of June, he resigned. But resigning was not the same as facing justice, and the bigger scandal was not about one man at all. It was about how many people knew and how long they had stayed quiet. What everybody knew. When the truth finally detonated, the most disturbing revelation was not what Robert Morris had done. It was how many people around him appeared to have known and chose to protect him anyway. A formal internal investigation conducted by a major law firm in the autumn of 2024 reached a damning conclusion. Nearly every single elder on Gateway's board had some knowledge of Morris's encounter with Cindy, and they had failed to ask the obvious questions that would have exposed the truth. When the investigation ended, the board was gutted, shrinking down to just 3 members. The damage spread far beyond Texas. In Colorado Springs, a pastor named Brady Boyd who had once worked under Morris and had even made him an overseer of his own church, was forced to resign after his elders concluded he had misled his congregation about what he knew. 2 more pastors at that same church were pushed out alongside him. The web of silence stretched across states and across decades, a quiet agreement among powerful men to look the other way. Inside Gateway itself, the financial collapse was staggering. Weekend attendance dropped by more than 20%, falling from around 25,000 people to roughly 19,000. At the original South Lake campus, the church itself admitted that attendance fell by 40%. One of the remaining elders appeared in a video confessing that the church had seen its tithes reduce by between 35 and 40%, which forced painful staff reductions and layoffs. Saturday services were canceled at most campuses. The famous annual Gateway Conference was scrapped, and a class action lawsuit was filed by church members who alleged that their tithes had been mishandled for years, a case that a federal judge refused to throw out in September of 2025. So the institution knew, the other pastors knew, the elders knew, and every time that fact lands, it forces us back to the one person who was closer to Robert Morris than any elder, any board member, any colleague in any state. If everybody knew, then what exactly does Debbie know? And why, through all of it, has she never once opened her mouth? The silence is the answer. So we arrive back where we started, in that Oklahoma courtroom, watching a convicted man kiss his wife before the handcuffs closed. The indictment came in March of 2025, handed down by a grand jury, with the Oklahoma Attorney General declaring that there could be no tolerance for those who prey on children, and that this case was all the more despicable because the perpetrator was a pastor who exploited his position. The guilty plea followed that October. The 6 months in jail came and went. The release in the spring of 2026 brought that first careful apology, the one in which he praised Debbie for walking beside him faithfully. Through every single one of these moments, the world kept waiting for the pastor's wife to speak. Surely now, people thought, surely after a guilty plea, after a jail sentence, after the registration as a sex offender, the blessed woman would say something, anything, a word of sorrow for the survivor, a word of explanation, a word of grief. Cindy Clemishire, for her part, has never stopped speaking. She stood in that courtroom and declared that she was no longer the silenced little girl he had abused. She said she was not a victim, but a survivor. She reminded the entire world that there is no such thing as consent from a 12-year-old child. And Debbie? From Debbie, all we have ever gotten is silence. No statement, no interview, no apology, no public reckoning of any kind. The title of this story promised that the pastor's wife would finally break her silence, and the truth, the honest and uncomfortable truth, is that she never has. Her silence is the statement. Her silence is the answer she has chosen to give. Because sometimes the loudest thing a person can do is say absolutely nothing at all, while standing next to a man the courts have called a child predator and calling it faithfulness. What do you think Debbie Morris should have said? And why do you believe she has stayed silent through all of it? Drop your honest thoughts in the comments below because I genuinely want to hear how this one sits with you.